Today we are going to be talking about charismatic leadership and using the example or the case study of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge and the incredible impact that he had in Cambodia in his time. And you could really liken him to Hitler. And there are many people who are unaware of the atrocities that were committed during his reign. So we'll get right into some of the information about him, and really gives you a good view on how charisma and how that leadership can really drive people to do things that are very much beyond what you think you are capable of. So we'll get into it. So his background, his original name was Salath Sar, and he became known as Brother Number 1, or Pol Pot, and he is from Cambodia, best known for killing a tally of 1 to 2 million, which was at that time about a third of the country's population. So a really unbelievable mass murder at that time. In the 1800s, Cambodia was part of France, and they were granted independence in 1953. During that time, there was a 16-year rule by Prince Norodom Sihanouk. However, during the war in Vietnam, there was some destabilization, so the country kind of became politically unstable, and any and all previous relationships with the U.S. was severed, and as a result there was some opposition to the prince. So he attempted to clamp down on the opposition and tried to direct change, but many of the groups who were opposing him refused to be intimidated and went underground, and they decided to take on a rebellion. This is when the Kampuchean Communist Party, or the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, or Salath Sar at the time, became very active. And this is when it got pretty unbelievable. So in 1967, not really that long ago, Pol Pot, he hid in the countryside, and his whole belief revolved around the fact that he wanted to return Cambodia to the original agricultural-based agrarian society. So that was his ideals, his communist ideal, that really drove him towards this. And as a result, he established a revolutionary army. And because the bombings of Vietnam became very close to the USA border, the Khmer Rouge gained a lot of popularity because they were fighting against this. So they were saying that they were sticking up for Cambodia against the US, which was a big deal. So between 1970 and 1973, the Khmer Rouge is able to gain control of 60% of Cambodia's territory and 25% of its population, which is a huge amount at that time. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge surrounded the capital, Phnom Penh, and within days they took it over, and the entire population of 2 million is sent to the countryside at gunpoint. So again, massive mass murdering happening. And at that time, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge are in control. So you can see here some images of Phnom Penh before, on the left there, showing just a regular city, high rises, trees, and after, just the mass destruction and bombing that took place. Pretty dramatic. So he declares year zero, which meant that he was trying to restart it. But at that time, it was the beginning again, and his attempt to purify capitalism, so get rid of it, any parts of Western culture, religion, any kind of foreign influence was being totally shunned and abolished. And Cambodia, he wanted them to become isolated and totally self-sufficient. So again, coming back to the agricultural state where they only grow what they need. They do not rely on anyone else. And of course, with this, no opposition being tolerated at all. So you can see all the Western influences of the vehicles, so destroying them and not letting people use them, going back to totally basic way of living. Their goal was to triple the agricultural output within a year, and he set up a secret inner circle that was close to him called the Angkar, and all of these members were identified by numbers, so brother 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. The public did not know that the Angkar was really the Kampuchean Communist Party, and they didn't really know who was behind the social change. So Pol Pot stayed very mysterious. They didn't really know who was driving. It wasn't like Hitler, who everyone knew who the leader was. It was more secretive, much more underground. First steps that they took at that time was getting rid of all the foreigners, closing all the foreign embassies, and the currency was abolished. And then all markets, schools, newspapers, any practices that were outside of the Communist Party's control were outlawed. So they were seen as against the beliefs of the party. Any members of society that were formally recognized were identified, so pulled out of their homes, pulled out of their offices, and executed without question. Again, trying to minimize the influence of what the current society, what their practices were. So anyone that was educated was gone. You can see here, photographed and then killed. Very dramatic, and not even with one thought. And these are people who hadn't killed people before and were all of a sudden mass murdering all types of citizens. So you can imagine, as a result, towns and cities were emptied, person after person being executed, and anyone who was left was called a new inhabitant. The entire population was forced to relocate to different agricultural collectives that had been set up for them to start to plant, and these became known as the killing fields. You can see here, this is the utopia that he was attempting to create, the farming collective. Inmates on these collectives existed very primitive situations and conditions. Families were no longer together. Monks were defrocked and put into labor brigades. Children were encouraged to spy on adults to find out information for the army. And former city residents went through all this political indoctrination. The result of all of this in the end was approximately 1.5 million died or were murdered. And this happened in various ways because of the situation. They were either worked to death because they were fed very little, not a lot to drink, starved to death, died of disease or exposure, or executed because they were not going along with what the rules were. And believe it or not, some of these, it's hard to believe that people were executed for these things, but they had very strict guidelines, and if you stepped out of line, there was no questions asked. You were just executed. So if you weren't working hard enough, if you complained about the living conditions, if you collected or stole food for your own personal consumption, if you were wearing jewelry or engaging in sexual relations, grieving the loss of friends or family, or expressing any religious sentiments. These are just some of the things that people were executed for. The results, of course, are astonishing. and the amount of dead continue to go up and up at a dramatic rate. So approximately 21 interrogations and detention sites were operating throughout the country. At the S21 detention center in Phnom Penh, the records show that 14,199 men, women, children were tortured and executed for anti-party sentiments between those 3 years, and only 7 of the people that were brought in left alive. Again, astonishing numbers. A lot of people tried to run away when they realized what was going on, but for many it was just too late. And you can see here, these are the victims' pictures. Even on the internal, he created this world of internal people who he trusted and who went along in the beginning, but you know, that was always changing, and he was always looking to get rid of people on the inside who knew too much. And if things weren't going as he expected or wanted, then he would randomly find someone on the internal of his office and execute them. So about 200,000 of those people were executed as well. And you can see here his escape to Thailand. I mean, it is amazing, this question really. We talk about charismatic leadership and why people follow. And it is hard to imagine following a leader such as this, but it happens over and over and over again. So, you know, as you go through the unit and you talk about influential leaders and people in Canadian history who have led and why good leaders exist and what their characteristics are. Many of those characteristics apply to people like Pol Pot. He just chooses to use them in a negative manner, obviously. So the final results, about 247 million people perished in those 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days of Pol Pot's rule. So, you know, with that, an amazing example of charismatic leadership. And I suggest you take the time to watch the documentary posted as well, because it's just astonishing. And they do a really good job of sharing a lot of the information and the specifics of what went on when he ruled. Enjoy!